So yes, thank you, Niels, for the introduction and the invite to speak here. This will be. I'm not quite sure what sort of talk this will be. It's very much my particular take on climate change and its intersections with various ideas about religious thought and practice. And that intersection between climate change and religion is something that I've been, well, I suppose in some sense you could say I've been thinking about all of my professional career. As a Christian, I don't separate out my personal faith from my professional thought life and practice and writing and education. So in a sense, it's always been there. But I think in particular over the last 15 to 17 years, I've felt it much more important to draw greater attention to the significance and actually the necessity for people who are concerned about climate change, whether of any religious faith or not, to take religion seriously. And so the ideas that I'm sort of summarizing here and offering have come out of that long train of thought and various experiences of interacting with people both of religious faith and no religious faith, or we could say of scientific faith. We were talking about faith and science before. Scientists, of course, are people of great faith. So it's very much my take on this intersection. And one landing point for the talk, but by the way, I've got about 40 minutes, is that right? One of the landing points, or the main landing point for the talk, hopefully is going to be this throwing out this idea or this question whether and to what extent at all the world in dealing with an issue like climate change can move in the same direction, either on convergent tracks or at least on parallel tracks, or whether actually climate change is something that actually escapes the ability of our collective agency and modes of thinking and organizing ourselves to be something that we can arrest appropriately. Anyway, we'll see. Hopefully we'll get there. So I often start off with this slide. What sort of problem is climate change? Is climate change a problem of the wrong energy technology? The problem is over 250 years, Western capitalist societies, now global capitalist societies mostly, have become overly reliant upon fossil energy, coal, oil and gas. And that lies at the very heart of the problem of climate change, and therefore we should frame climate change as an energy technology challenge. Or is the problem not just simply about an energy transition? Actually, the problem is an economics problem in that we haven't properly internalized the external costs of different types of energy generation, whether fossil or not, but particularly fossil, and the damage that it causes to climate and various other elements of our ecosystem. So is this an economics challenge? Is this actually more fundamental? Is this a challenge of consumption, of materialism, the ever expanding material throughput of the global economy, driven by individual or collective imperatives to consume more? The End of Nature, Bill McKibben, I throw this up. This was one of the very early books I read in 1989. Very inspiring to me at the time. And at the time, this idea of the end of nature, of course, it played into a particular trope, which has never been eradicated from the climate change discussion, which is that climate change is actually fundamentally about the disappearance of the very idea of a nature that is separate from humans. Whether that idea actually ever existed or not is another question, but this is the way that many within the environmental movements have in the past, and maybe some still today, frame the problem here. Is it a question of justice? We can talk about the various forms of inequality that are made much more visible because of a changing climate. Injustice is always present in human societies, but climate change has, as it were, illuminated, has unveiled some of these injustices in quite a direct and dramatic way. Is climate change actually an issue of adaptation? And here's a narrative that we could actually think of the whole human evolutionary story as a story of continual adaptation to environmental constraints and challenges and hazards. And in a sense, climate change, human exacerbated climate change, is simply, as it were, accelerating that evolutionary story. And it just demands of us ever more creative, imaginative ways of living with environmental challenges and constraints. Dark Mountain Project, that's a different narrative. This little symbol here, Stop Geoengineering. I'll come back to this towards the end with a little case study of geoengineering, solar geoengineering. Because for some, actually climate change is now such a problem that is not being arrested by any of these other dimensions, that it demands a brute force solution. And by a brute force solution, I mean, in effect, let's use the metaphor of a thermostat, dimming the strength of the sun. And there are technologies that can relatively easily be deployed at not exorbitant cost in order to do that. And if we see climate change in that sort of a way, then it's a very different type of challenge. So there we go, lots of different ways in which climate change has been framed, can be framed, is framed by different political actors in different places for different reasons. And of course, depending how it's being framed, the types of interventions or solutions that are being proposed will be very different. In a lot of this, religion doesn't get, or at least historically, I would argue, has not had very much of a voice. And I use this example from Pachari, who was the chair of the IPCC, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the fifth assessment report at the end of that. What is actually going to motivate this? It's going to be knowledge and understanding of science. Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus Climate, is entirely silent about religion in 500 pages of lament against the capitalist world order. And she laments the climate movement has not found its moral energy. And she seems entirely blind to the very presence of religion, let alone its moral potential for moral energy. Or take the IPCC. In the fifth assessment report, I checked this out, Arthur can correct me. In the fifth assessment report of the IPCC, 5,500 pages, 1.5 million words, the IPCC mentioned religion just 13 times. In the sixth assessment report, just from 3 years ago, 7,500 pages, 2.5 million words, there is one index entry. There's 150 pages of indexes to these 2.5 million words. There is just one entry for religion. The word religion just once, and one page. There's only one page where it comes. There are a few more, I have to admit, a few more isolated mentions of religion within AR5 compared to AR4, but it is still, I would argue, present by its absence, within the way in which this gathering and collection of expertise under oversight of the world's governments think about climate change. So, blind to religion, but then of course there are other voices that are most definitely, of course, not blind to religion. I love this quote that I use from the Alliance of Religions and Conservation. This emphasis on science, consumption, economics, and policy usually fails to engage people. This is the moral energy that Naomi Klein is lamenting, but is blind to identifying where at least one of the roots of that comes from, which is the narrative, the mythological, the metaphorical, and the faith, the holders of these areas. And without these, policies will have very few real roots. And this quote is from Willis Jenkins, who I've interacted with a few times over the years. And he puts this again very eloquently here, that humanity's ecological relations have religious and cultural dimensions. And these issues connect environmental questions with the fundamental human questions of meaning, value, and purpose. So if that is the case, if actually these environmental concerns, not least climate change, engage with these fundamental questions that we all have as humans about meaning, value, and purpose, then it seems astonishing that has not been, at least historically, more attention paid to the role of religion in this. Why is religion relevant? Here are just 4 reasons that clearly the way in which different religious traditions have evolved shapes and identifies particular cosmologies and therefore beliefs and values that are activated in different ways in the individual faith followers. Religions at an institutional level actually have the potential at least to mobilize very large, broad mass movements, which might seem not entirely irrelevant to some of the challenges that climate change presents to us. Significant institutional and economic resources, a more practical point here, that if we recognize that somewhere like 80 to 85% of the world's population self-identify with one of the major world religions, this is a major institutional resource for good or ill, but it's not something that can be ignored, which for too long perhaps has been the case with the academy, the higher academy, certainly in Western Europe at least. And in fact, my colleague in Pembroke College, James Garden, who's the Dean of Pembroke College, he gave the university lecture last year at St Mary's Church in Cambridge. And he used that exact theme in his sermon to the university. The arrogance of Western academics to presume that religion, he wasn't specifically talking about Christianity, obviously his focus was on Christianity, but the arrogance to presume that Christianity actually is a narrative and a dead faith or a dead belief. And James pointed to the vibrancy and the liveliness of religious Christian expression around the world today. And then finally, cultivate social capital. And I'll give 1 or 2 examples of this. That this is actually a practical way in which human communities respond to various challenges, not least ecological and environmental challenges. And these faith, religious communities and networks can bring about change. So, to me, this is self-evidently the case, but I have felt it necessary to make some of these arguments to parts of the climate change community. However, what actually is it then when we're thinking about the challenges that climate change presents to the world? What actually does religion bring? Does religion speak with one voice? It certainly is no panacea. So this was from 2007, gathering of some of the world's faith communities on a Greenland glacier, famously Ilulissat Fjord in Western Greenland, that's quite dramatically been retreating. And one other example that I really like, this is from Hannah Fair, a geographer who did a PhD a few years ago at UCL, working with Pacific Island communities to understand their particular readings of climate change in relation to their religious faith. And this was an article that she published based on her PhD, 3 Stories of Noah. And she found these 3 stories circulating within these island communities. Different members of these island communities would adhere to one or other of these different interpretations of Noah. So here again, we're back to unification or diversification of outlooks. Noah as offering the covenantal promise that never again would the world be allowed to flood. So this implied, therefore, a covenantal theology, and what believers were called upon to do was to pray and to trust that God would honor his promise. The second was the parable of preparedness, planning in the face of danger, building arks. So for Pacific Islanders, what this indicates is that islanders should be preparing in order to enhance their resilience to survive whatever changes in their marine environments may follow. A very pragmatic theology. Or the third one here, the suffering God, who stands beside those who suffer injustice, stand up for those who suffer, a liberation theology impulse. So what Hannah found within these religious communities, Christian religious communities in the Pacific, these 3 different narratives that adhered in different ways to different parts of those communities. So have religions responded? Okay, so it's not just about worldviews and beliefs, and you know, sometimes when commentators do bring religion into discourse, into relationship with other discourses, there's a tendency to think of religious belief in terms of doctrine, and cognitive processes. Actually, for many religions, of course, it's about making meaning. It's about the cultural imaginary. It's about the moral commitments that we live by and that we relate to others by. It's a lived out expression of something internal. And so different religions, communities in response to climate change have reacted in lots of ways. I mentioned Operation Noah. Different examples over the years. You'll be familiar perhaps with far more of these than I will. And one sees this pretty much, I think, now across the entire spectrum of institutional world religion. Not just the Abrahamic faiths, Buddhism, Hinduism, Sikhism, and so on. And these have manifestations in different settings. The eco-church movement here in the UK. This 10 pledge idea. This was a particular one that I was involved a little bit with a few years ago down in Cornwall, initiated by a very energetic young, or maybe not so young, entrepreneur Lucy Isaacson. So we see these types of expressions operating at the level of particular religious communities trying to engage with climate change. I've mentioned before about adaptation, this idea that actually the social capital that religious faith brings to particular communities or environments actually is a force for good in the sense of risk sharing, burden sharing, of attending to the needs of those who are less advantaged than others. Lots of different examples around the world. This book, How the World's Religions Are Responding to Climate Change by Robin Feldman, captures some of these. And I was interested just to see a few weeks ago in the New York Times, not the most religious of media outlets, I suspect, but actually gave very big prominence to a news story from Indiana, of evangelical Christians putting up solar panels to do God's work, following this biblical mandate to care for creation. Of course, this is a trope that one sees, it pops up in lots of different places around the world. But just I was interested to see this highlighted just a few weeks ago in the New York Times. Yeah. And then the Evangelical Climate Initiative, this is a few years old now. And this was particularly targeted at the US evangelical community. Sir John Horton, who led the IPCC scientific assessment for 14 years. Interesting, actually, thinking about this now, is given Horton's very public commitment to Christian belief, actually, why he didn't feel able to or didn't want to give more emphasis or attention to religion within some of those earlier IPCC assessments when he was actively leading at it. But anyway, Horton, as a senior climate scientist, was involved in this US Evangelical Climate Initiative, and Catherine Wilkinson wrote a really interesting book. She did her PhD at Oxford about 10 years ago, Between God and Green, which gives an account of her anthropological work with church communities in the south of America, evangelical communities in the south, who are trying to give expression to this Evangelical Climate Initiative. So different examples there. Now, I mentioned before about solar geoengineering, and I'm just going to give this little case study because I think this idea of climate change being a problem of such magnitude and importance, where the perception is that not enough is being done to arrest it, that it demands the serious contemplation of what I call this brute force solution, which in particular, this idea of solar geoengineering is to spray particles into the stratosphere to reflect sunlight back into space. It's in effect mimicking what natural volcanoes do. When a large explosive volcano erupts around the world, it pumps huge amounts of particulates into the high atmosphere, the stratosphere. And we know, empirically, we've seen this cools the climate at the surface. So if you want to cool the climate, let's just mimic volcanoes. And this is, and the reason I sort of throw this in here is just, this is an idea that's been circulating now for 20 years, always on the fringes of scientific discussion, never really mainstream, always seen as a little bit too much adventurism. However, over the last 4 or 5 years, I would say, this idea has become given much more prominence within climate scientists, within climate engineers, but also within the philanthropic sector, within governments. The UK government has just invested £60 million of public research money into researching these technologies. Huge amount of money in the context of the UK public science budget. We're seeing large philanthropic organizations that have spilled out from venture capital now pumping millions of dollars into researching these technologies. Just last week in London, during London Climate Action Week, there was one of the events in London brought together scientists, policymakers, philanthropists, and business entrepreneurs to discuss this idea. And I think it's an interesting case to explore this nexus between climate change, science, and religion, and ethics. Because it asks us these questions that I've hinted at in the earlier parts of the talk. This idea of a developmental paradigm for thinking about environmental stewardship? Is actually this the end result of that impulse? That actually using our creative abilities, our inventive capacities of engineering the planet, we're actually, it's not just putting solar panels on a roof that's doing God's work. Actually, solar geoengineering is doing God's work. It actually is trying to arrest some of the damage that has been caused by an unfettered climate change. Is that the case? Are the limits of technology? Is this actually, is this the other side of the Janus face of technology, the other side of it, that this is actually humans seeking more control and more power than they've been delegated? What are the ethics of the scientific research? Do the ends justify the means? It opens up different questions about what do we think we're doing with this type of intervention. Are we restoring? Are we healing? Are we repairing? Who is it now? I think there's Willis Jenkins, or no, there was. It might have been Willis Jenkins had a lovely essay about these metaphors. It might have been also an Australian called Lauren Rickards who wrote it. Anyway, different metaphors here have very different connotations about what's going on. Is it healing? Is it restoring? Or is it actually taking control, humans taking control of the world climate? So this is trying to then to enhance or to improve. And again, here it seems to me that there are some deliberate, or there are some very specific parallels with the way in which we see technology being advocated in other areas, not least being human enhancement. I'm throwing these out as questions. I don't have answers to these. I just find that this idea of solar geoengineering is such a powerful idea, and it raises exactly the sort of questions where religious faith and ethics and science converge. There have been some religious voices that have spoken about this, most notably Forrest Klingerman in his book, Theological and Ethical Perspectives on Climate Engineering. This idea of playing God. And actually there's a later one here, a multi-faith response to the prospect of climate engineering that he edited. And here's an example of Islam and climate engineering, which I don't know the details of, but it's just interesting to me that there are some of these other faith traditions are also beginning to think through these types of questions with this type of technology. So I think, yes, it raises this parallel question: Are we going down a route of designer climates in a parallel way to the potential ability to manipulate the human germline, which of course became very controversial a few years ago when the Chinese biologist Hu Jiankey claimed that he actually had manipulated the human germline in two embryos, and he was immediately fired. It generated a very powerful backlash from that biomedical community. However, this is not going to go away, and there are other ways in which, of course, human enhancement technologies are being deployed at the moment and potentially in the future. So, is this a comparable issue? Some bioethicists have argued for a red line around germline modification. I'm one of those actually who's also argued for a red line around solar geoengineering. There's a group of about 500 social scientists who've signed a non-use agreement on solar geoengineering. And we actually, have drawn a red line and say, actually, it's not just about not researching it, it actually is about not deploying it. And should never be, if it should never be deployed, it should not be researched. Is this actually of that type of magnitude? Or does climate change, do the risks and dangers and threats of climate change actually demand that humans do try to take control of the climate in this brute force way. So yeah, stakes are higher, well, different higher. And I don't know if anyone knows more about Reinhold Niebuhr than I do. I'm sure you do. But he wrote something along these lines, I think, many years ago. Dangers of human overreach. So there we go. This is where I've landed. Is there a shared way out with climate change? For those who have worked very hard over 30 or so years to look at transnational governance of climate change through the Framework Convention, the idea that somehow we can get the world's nations working together to deliver a particular set of outcomes, whether it was the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, or whatever. The ambition or the aspiration for a single strategic narrative. A few years ago, some colleagues wrote about this, the need for the world to unify around a single strategic narrative. They actually came out of strategic studies and military studies, where, of course, maybe one of the first principles, if you're going to win a war, you have to have a very clear set of war aims and follow a very particular narrative. They put climate change into that type of framing. Well, I didn't see any chance of that happening. Emergency declarations are a sense of actually, again, almost trying to find a brute force solution. By declaring an emergency, whether from the smallest jurisdiction, whether a school does it or a local authority does it or a city does it, up to the United Nations, which Gutierrez has done, does declaring a climate emergency unify in any meaningful way, other than being a rhetorical maneuver? I'm somewhat skeptical about that, I would have to say. And as many social scientists have pointed out, emergencies are dangerous things to declare, because in the names of emergencies, very bad things have been done in human history. It also sort of bleeds into some of this apocalyptic rhetoric that has always, again, been around the edges, if not the inner margins of climate discourse. The environmental movement has always been apocalyptic in some regards, as Lawrence Buell, the American eco-critic, pointed out a long time ago. David Wallace Wells, The Uninhabitable Earth, Mike Hulme, Here We're Doomed, The Outcome is Death, It's the End of Most Life on the Planet. These types of discourses, they're an attempt to mobilize, at least at the emotional level, I would suggest, and therefore seen to be a way of gaining convergence among political actors. Again, I'm not sure they're very successful, and I find this also quite interesting. This is a book written by Tom Albrecht and Tristan Stum, came out last year, Apocalyptic Conspiracism. It's based on Tom's PhD thesis at Belfast University that I examined a few years ago. This is the book version of it. And he examines this American expression of apocalyptic conspiracism amongst social media on the internet. But the interesting point he makes at the end here is that this sort of strange symmetry between some of the American fundamentalists who see the end of the world approaching, whether through climate change or through other trials and tribulations, and have created the Rapture Index, which is a numerical way of plotting how close the world is to the rapture, with the expression or the symbolic expression that comes out of the climate apocalypse, which is the climate clock, the ticking clock. Times Square has the clock ticking to the 29th of July, 2029, when the end comes for climate change. And there's strange symmetry between these different ways of thinking to try to mobilize or to try to unify disparate people, but obviously from very different standpoints, those two different communities. Or maybe on a more positive note, and I often will use this example, not necessarily because somehow this is the papal encyclical Laudato Si has got the power, the necessary power, or the reach or the agency to converge the world around a single narrative. It won't do that necessarily, but it does have mobilizing power. And I think what I like about this for me is that within his 10,000 words of Laudato Si, the Pope offers a holistic, coherent story of humanity, of science, of justice, of ethics, of individual agency and responsibility. And he does that in a way that is not it's not overly assertive. It does justice to each of those different dimensions of human experience and ability. I think he also, actually he talks about technology, again, the Janus face of technology. It's in there, recognizing that humans are creators, but for good or for ill, but he recognizes technology. So I use this as to me, this is the type of more holistic narrative that is not overly assertive, it's not overly optimistic, but equally it offers hope. And various organizations, of course, have spun out from that over the last few years. I think, Celia, you're very involved in one of these. So I end on that point. Not that somehow this is any panacea, but it seems to me it offers much more than an apocalyptic rhetoric will ever do, that science can ever possibly do as a single narrative, or that ticking clocks, will mobilize, somehow galvanize social movements to deliver a climate solution, or indeed the idea of solar geoengineering, which to me is a very one-eyed solution.
So my first word really is gratitude to being invited to respond to this really wide-ranging and informative talk, and of course the whole complexity of the issues around climate change belies any possible easy solution. And so I really appreciated, Mike, the way you've actually recognized that. You've recognized the complexity, you've recognized the different voices, you've also recognized the divergence within even within one religious tradition as well as across, but you've also recognized the movement to some kind of unity or thrust towards something that will actually help, maybe change the map. So, and I also agree with the overall analysis of the exclusion of religion from secular discourses, in spite of many sort of efforts otherwise. And I also try and wonder why that is the case. And I think part of it is because theology and religion in particular has been the Cinderella subject in academia for a very long time. So I know people in the University of St Andrews, Aberdeen, for example, who were actually trying to get rid of the theology department. They were scientists that I was involved in an exchange with through the Templeton Foundation a few years ago. So there's a deep suspicion there, but on the other hand, in a way, they're shooting themselves in the foot because it's so important, in terms of what could or could not be done. And I was also very pleased to see ARC there. I actually worked with Martin Palmer, who founded the Alliance of Religion and Conservation back in the early 90s. The the particular foundation he had then was called ICOREC, the International Consultancy on Religion, Education and Culture. And he tried to bring different religious groups together to think about, specifically think about climate issues and ecological issues. So I wrote a book then called The Handbook in Theology and Ecology that was sponsored by the Worldwide Fund for Nature. So in other words, there were some sort of secular organizations that did recognize the importance of religion, but it was a bit of an uphill struggle. Fazlun Khalid was also in our team. I was sort of responsible for the religious aspects related to Christianity. It was while I was finishing my doctorate at the University of Manchester, but Fazlun then went on to found IFES, the Islamic Foundation for Ecology and Environmental Sciences, and we had one sort of logo of his, but I just wanted to flag that up. But that was back in 1994. So all these sort of groups were trying to find a common cause, and it converged in a meeting in Assisi in 1986 when Pope John Paul II, and this again was organized by Martin Palmer, Pope John Paul II and all the other world leaders of religions came together to try and think more about the issues of climate and ecology and so on. And I think it's also very important in relation to the possible mobilization in the social sphere, which is what many of us in this particular conference are interested in. I would have to say, though, that there is a risk here, which you didn't touch on, and that is from the perspective of theology, at least, there's a risk that religion can be instrumentalized. In other words, the idea that that religious believers are somehow used by secular scientists in order to get hubris. On that basis, thank you very much, and over to discussion.